Good evening, Steve Sadwick, Assistant Town Manager here at the Town of Tewksbury. Tonight is December 10th. This was the presentation that we had last evening for the Tewksbury zoning bylaw update. And we're going to run through this presentation again tonight. And we have some people in the audience. We'll take questions, and then at the end, we'll have the ability of how additional input can be provided to us on this project. The whole project is gearing up towards the annual town meeting in May of 2020. So this slide is basically the titles from all of the slides in this deck. So we'll go through this stuff fairly quickly, but I thought it was necessary to kind of hit on these points of who the committee is, the consultants, the activity that's been undertaken by the zoning bylaw committee, the scope that was laid out by the Board of Selectmen, and then we get into talking about the bylaw itself. So the zoning bylaw committee is made up of Robert Fowler, who is the planning board representative, Ed Johnson, who is the building commissioner, and by virtue of that title, he serves as the zoning enforcement officer here in the town of Tewksbury. Richard Cuco, who is a representative of developers, and that's both here in town and represents a number of developers in other communities, so we're getting an outside perspective. Erin Wortman, who is a resident of Tewksbury, but she is the Town of Stoneham's Community Development Director. You can see there the designation of AICP. She is a certified land use planner through the American Institute of Certified Planners. And then Mark Kratman is the Board of Selectmen representative. The consultants that we have on hire that had assisted the committee on this project are Judy Barrett, and those were the two organizations that she worked for during this project's time frame. Judy has extensive background in planning, zoning, housing, community development. She's worked on a number of projects here in the town of Tewksbury. She was involved in our 2003 master plan, the 2016 master plan update, and then she was a sub-consultant on the Vision 2037 plan. Robert Mitchell is a planner that has probably 35, 40 years experience. Bob served as the planning director in Burlington, Vermont, planning director in Amherst, Massachusetts. He was an adjunct professor at the University of Massachusetts. At Amherst, in the planning department, he's worked for the state in the Housing and Economic Development Department and is now doing consulting work. Robert Ritchie is an attorney who served as town council for the town of Amherst and then was an assistant attorney general and oversaw the municipal law unit where all towns throughout the Commonwealth send their bylaws, both zoning and general bylaws, that need Attorney General's approval to that office. So again, Bob has some very extensive background in looking at bylaws. He's also worked on zoning reform for probably the past 15, 20 years at the State House. And then David Gamble is a architect who has done a number of projects and was a sub-consultant to this project in helping come up with design standards for town center. He's got projects that he's worked on in Andover, Lexington, and a number of those projects, specifically Andover, is really starting to move forward. That project is the yards, which was the former DPW yard that has been relocated, and now it's going to be going through a redevelopment process. And staff, myself, I've been with the town of Tewksbury 18 and a half years, I think, experience in Stoneham and Syracuse, New York. Anna McGinty to my left, who has been with us a year now as town planner, and then Don Cathcart, who is a permit technician in the building department for the last 14 years, I think, but Don also serves as the recording secretary for the planning board. So Don has been present at planning board meetings for a number of years, taking down the minutes and taking it all in as far as developments that are before the board. She also did recording secretary duties for the planning board zoning bylaw subcommittee, which ran from about 2003 up until 2015. So the zoning bylaw committee has been in formation since 2016. It's a committee that was appointed by the Board of Selectmen. They've met about 35 times so far. There's been 2 public input sessions. There was a public presentation with the planning board. This is with those design standards that David Gamble had brought forward. There was a presentation to the Board of Selectmen and the planning board this past June. And then tonight is the second night of our December public presentations. And there will be 3 presentations scheduled for January. 2 of those will be evening sessions. And then there will be a daytime session. There's a lot of words on this slide, but so the selectmen appointed the committee in 2016 to accomplish the following. And you can see here that it was to select a consultant to review and update the town's zoning bylaw, look at existing language of the bylaw to make sure that it's in compliance with the most recent edition of the State Zoning Act. And the committee, working with the consultant, would work with the planning board, zoning board of appeals, economic development council, town council, to develop a bylaw that's consistent with the town's master plan. Throughout the history of planning in this country, a master plan really kind of sets the vision and the framework, and zoning becomes an implementation tool of the master plan. So throughout this presentation, I'll be making references to both the 2003 and 2016 master plans that the town had completed. Prompt and predictable permitting while protecting abutters' rights was a goal that was laid out by the Board of Selectmen to the committee. And then you can see here that the project would include looking at various zoning districts, and the committee did do that, and some of those will be described this evening. And then the draft zoning bylaw will be prepared for town meeting as an end result of the project, and that's about the phase that we're entering into right now. So new features of this zoning bylaw: there was a zoning diagnostic that was conducted by the consultants. They came in, they looked at the bylaw, and they really didn't hold back any punches. They had a lot of comments as to inconsistencies that we had in the bylaw, and there were other things that were not completely in compliance with state or federal statutes. So this new product that we have, the draft zoning bylaw, kind of achieves all of this of addressing the things that were pointed out in the zoning diagnostic. The recodifying of the bylaw for ease of use and future updates. The current numbering system in the bylaw has become a challenge when amendments are being made. It's limiting in the way that it's structured. If anyone's familiar with it, we're using a 1,000 series numbering series, and it just becomes hard when you start getting into subsections of those series. So we're going back to a system which we used prior to 2002 and which is more prevalent throughout the Commonwealth and the country. This zoning bylaw is going to reflect recent town meeting votes. That means that the billboards were pulled into this. The adult use for marijuana or recreational marijuana, the vote that occurred this past fall is incorporated into this bylaw. So that's how we're reflecting the recent town meeting votes. The zoning map, again, is amended to reflect that 2003 and 2016 master plan. And in both of those both of those master plans, there was talk about breaking up a commercial district along Route 38, which runs from the Lowell line to the Wilmington line. And as most of us know, driving down Route 38, there are different areas along Route 38. And so these master plans told us we shouldn't treat all of these sections the same. We attempted to try and treat them differently with overlay districts, and now this bylaw is proposing to actually say there's no longer an overlay district. This is the new proposed zoning district for this section of Route 38. And then lastly, we have strengthening design guidelines for town center, which has its own section in the zoning bylaw. Currently, we're operating with design guidelines which are outside of the zoning bylaw today, and what we're doing with this draft is actually bringing the guidelines into the zoning itself. So the changes in how the bylaw is organized, and this kind of gets to the issue about why it's difficult to show this as a red line strikeout type document, because things are moving all over the place, and some whole sections are being lifted and put to the front. In other instances, we're pulling bits and pieces from the existing bylaw and placing it into one consolidated area. So Section 2 of the new bylaw is definitions, and we've expanded on a number of definitions in the bylaw. Administration was moved to the front of the bylaw, and that's Section 3. The establishment of districts is Section 4, which I think in the current bylaw, it's probably the 2000 section of the bylaw. District regulations under Section 5 is really a significant section of the bylaw because it pulls together district regulations. We have descriptions of districts, which we don't have in our current bylaw today. Dimensional and density requirements are in this section. All of the uses that are allowed, or uses that are exempt or prohibited, are in this section. And then we have 4 remaining overlay districts that reside in this section. Section 6, as I said, we were consolidating a number, or pulling things into a consolidated section. Section 6 is that section where it is site development standards. So that includes parking, loading, landscaping, signs, and those town center standards. Now, the current bylaw, when it comes to parking, for example, is in Section 5000 of the current bylaw, but you'll find it scattered in other sections of the bylaw, all the way out to Section 9000, which has site plan special permit in it, and it talks about landscaping, buffers, and parking, and it becomes very difficult for people to navigate going back and forth, looking at it and saying, well, geez, do I comply with the buffers that are in Section 5000, or do I comply with what it's telling me in 9400? So in this bylaw, we've brought everything together, so all parking, all loading, all landscaping is here in Section 6. Section 7 is special regulations. These are outlined here: family suites, home occupations, solar farms, and adult entertainment. And then lastly, Section 8 is other development regulations, and that's where things such as non-conforming uses and structures, regulations relative to multifamily dwellings, the affordable housing requirements, open space, which I just noticed was a typo, residential development, wireless communication facilities, and adult use marijuana establishments fall into Section 8 of the proposed bylaw. So as I had stated, some of these additions to the bylaw, there are new definitions that were added to the bylaw. Site plan review is a new section of the bylaw, and we had this conversation last night. One of the zoning bylaw committee members brought up a very good point about talking about the differences between site plan and special permits, and that special permits really address what is allowed, what's not allowed, and then what's in between and is discretionary, which is special permits. So a special permit will say you can locate in this district on this parcel, but you have to meet certain conditions. It just gives it a greater level of scrutiny. Site plan is really about how it fits on that site. And so there are a number of places where we have these use special permits, which will say that by a special permit of the planning board, going through a hearing process, you can locate, we will accept you locating in this parcel. The site plan review component is, how is that going to work? How is it going to meet public safety requirements? How is the drainage going to work? How is buffers going to work? All of that is wrapped up in site plan review. So we're introducing site plan review as a standalone approval process, and not part of the special permit process. The two can work together, or they can work independent of each other. Currently today, we have use special permits that show up in the use table. We have use special permits that are identified in section 9500, which are geared more towards certain triggers as far as size of projects are concerned. And then we have site plan special permit. So it becomes very confusing to applicants and to abutters as to what's being applied for and where certain authority lies. So we're really trying to clean this up finally and say special permits are just for use. Site plan review will just specifically be for reviewing of site plans. Request for reasonable accommodations is something new that the consultants brought forward, and this would be a application to the Zoning Board of Appeals for compliance with the American with Disabilities Act and also the Fair Housing Act. So that's a new feature. As I said, district purposes are now spelled out and incorporated in Section 5 of the bylaw. The Town Center District Development Standards, again, is something that is no longer going to reside outside of the zoning bylaw. It will be part of the zoning bylaw. And then to reflect the town meeting vote, adult use marijuana establishments are included in this bylaw. Things that were removed from the bylaw were single-family structures being allowed in commercial and industrial districts. There was, prior to these public presentations, we had joint meetings with the planning board and the zoning bylaw committee, and we had a very spirited conversation about this, and it basically came down to, if a district is commercial or industrial, we have said, the town has said, that's what we want in those districts. So to allow for a single family structure in those districts didn't make sense, and that's why it's being proposed to be stricken from the bylaw. The transition district requirement regulations, this is really one of the only districts in town that has its own separate regulations, and those regulations are really just a mishmash of things that were put in there that can be addressed at a more global level across all districts. It was hours of operation, there were some buffer requirements, all of that stuff is kind of picked up now in other sections of the bylaw. The accessory uses in office research district, again, this was another spirited conversation, but I think it was more with the zoning bylaw committee itself, in that they talked about, we have currently in the bylaw the allowance for personal service establishments, retail, and those types of things in the office research district, but it has to be accessory to a building or an office park. And when you look at the map and what is in the office research district, that is Innovation Drive, L3 Systems, Thermo Fisher, Raytheon, and the other properties along Ames Pond Corporate Drive, up on Andover Street, and then down North Street a little bit. So when you look at that as a whole, it was basically, well, geez, there's not really an office park there. There's no there. So they said, let's get rid of the accessory uses, and those uses that were identified as accessory, let's just allow them in the district. So that was the discussion that led to the removal of accessory uses in the office district. The wireless overlay district was an attempt to try and physically locate on the map where cell towers could go. And this evolved over a long period of time. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 basically gave cellular providers a lot of leeway, and in fact, if they are denied the ability to locate in a community, they can actually take the community to federal district court versus going through the state court system. So there's a lot of protections that they have at the federal level, and our consultants had advised us to remove the district itself, which governs the location of where they can go, but keep in a section, which I believe is section 8, keep in a section which talks about how they can be designed so that there is some level of control. There's still a special permit that they'd have to go through. The reality of it is that we haven't had a cellular tower proposed in Tewksbury in the last 10 years. And we're now heading into the 5G world where they're going to small cell locations. So instead of the big towers, what we're going to be seeing is antennas on top of utility poles. And that wave is going to start hitting communities pretty quickly. And we're in the process of looking. We have, the selectmen had passed design controls on this already, and we're also going to be looking at a bylaw. We have a legal consultant that's helping us look at that outside of this project here. The MFD 55 district and community development districts were both removed from the bylaw. And basically, we still have MFD, we still have a multifamily district that's allowed. And if a developer proposes a 55 and older development, that would be allowed under the the multifamily district guidelines. And the things that were in the community development district were specifically written for the Court Street well fields, which became Emerald Court. So that whole campus concept and all of the types of services that they provide there can now be provided in a multifamily district in town. So the thought was, we really don't need those two districts when you have something that's a little bit more generic. These two overlay districts were completely removed. The Highway Corridor Overlay District is off of Route 93 down by South Street. This is where Mills had proposed a mall at that location 15 years ago. And basically where retail is today and where malls are today, a lot of them are closing or shrinking in size. And the likelihood of getting a mall in that location with an off-ramp, which is required in the zoning bylaw today, that you would have to have an off-ramp off of 93, the likelihood of that happening is probably less than 10%. The market's not there with online buying, and as far as transportation dollars are concerned, we were told 10 years ago that they didn't like interchanges that only served one side of an interstate. And we were trying to pitch this as it would be serving Andover and connecting to Andover's local network. And in Tewksbury, it would not connect to our local network. It would only connect to that parcel. So it was a very difficult battle. And like I said, the likelihood of getting an interchange there that would just serve the parcel, we're not going to see. The Community Village Overlay District, is proposed to be removed, and it is going to be it'll end up being other districts that we have. There's some multifamily districts that the community village overlay district will become. There's some mixed-use business districts that it'll become, but that was a very liberal, wide-open type district, and by removing that, there are other things that are being put in place that will have more controls for land development. Development impact statements here is something that was put in back in 2002 when we went through that last zoning recodification. And the thought was to try and mirror what is required in the MEPA process, which is the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act. And what we have found is that this may have been used on one project because it's not a mandatory requirement. And in discussing this with the committee, it's basically if a project comes in that's going to trip the triggers that we have for development impact statement, it's also going to trip the triggers for the MEPA review that would occur at the state level. So the thought was to remove that from the zoning bylaw. And then, as I referenced earlier, section 9500 is the use special permit section of the current bylaw, and that has more triggers that are relative to the size of the buildings, and it doesn't talk about uses themselves. So that just seemed to be a confusing section and would be adequately covered under the current bylaw with the site plan review and the use special permits through the table of uses. So the modifications, here you see town center overlay, village residential overlay, village mixed use overlay, South Village overlay. They've all been shifted from overlay districts on Route 38 to now underlying districts. They're going to become the district. It is a town center district. It is a village residential district. It is a mixed-use business district. And I think it's South Business District. So Route 38 is going to be broken up and it will no longer be a commercial district with overlays. Again, the whole thought about that is that instead of having an overlay which had some additional benefit or uses for these sections of Route 38, and you had the underlying commercial district, it was basically, let's just have one district, the South Business District or the Town Center District, not Town Center on top of commercial. Item B here, the 291 feet deep along each side of Main Street Commercial District. This is a very strange rule that you don't find. I haven't seen this anyplace else, and I don't think the consultants have either, where the zoning on Route 38, again, from Wilmington to Lowell, that commercial district is 291 feet off of the center line, I believe, it's the property line at Route 38, 291 feet deep, and then all the way down Route 38. So it splits a number of parcels, which creates a number of problems where a parcel may be 291 feet of commercial district and then another 300 feet of residential or heavy industrial. So we're getting rid of this section by using parcels. All of the zoning districts are going to be taken to the parcel line so that we're not going to have these split zoned parcels in the future. Billboards, again, is significant modifications. This came up in these joint meetings that we had with the planning board. The billboard article that was passed at the town meeting had an amendment to put 1,000 feet, that a billboard couldn't be any closer than 1,000 feet of a residential or multifamily district or use. And talking with the planning board about this, it was basically, instead of having people go to the zoning board of appeals for a variance on this distance requirement. It was take a look and see if you could come up with a number that seemed more reasonable, but yet still protect residential properties. So the 500 feet of residential use that's being proposed in this zoning bylaw, 500 feet is about the width of the right-of-way of the interstate. So that kind of gives you an idea of how far a billboard would have to be from a residential use. And in saying residential use versus district, you could have a district that may not have any residential use on it. You could have a property that may be zoned multifamily, and the house or the multifamily project or development could be up on the street, and yet way in the back could be the district boundary, and you would have to be, under the way the bylaw is currently written, you'd have to be 1,000 feet from there. So what the thought here is that it's the physical building itself. It's that residential use. It's 500 feet from a house. It's 500 feet from an apartment building. Medical marijuana, there was also an interest in these joint meetings to try and entice a dispensary to locate in town. And so the discussion was, should we make the overlay district for medical marijuana larger, or is there something else that we could do? So the thought here was to remove the 5,000 square foot cap that exists today, and also the requirement that only one non-exempt dispensary could be located in town. And I think that's trying to shake things up a little bit to allow for a dispensary in town. There's probably more that can be done, and the committee may want to look a little bit more closely at that issue. The large-scale ground-mounted solar facilities, those are the solar farms, the minimum lot size was reduced from 20 to 5 acres, and this was based on information that we had received from a consultant that works for Northern Middlesex Council of Governments. He was working on a project which was called Soul Smart, which was a federal designation, and he had a significant amount of experience with other communities as far as solar farms, and gathered the data for us, and we looked at it and said, 20 is too large, and 5 seems to be about what is being built in other communities. So that's where this reduction to 5 acres came from. And then lastly, the affordable housing requirement, 15% is required in multifamily developments. Today, the affordable housing requirement for multifamily developments is 15%, but there's an option there that you can either build the 15% in the multifamily development, or you can pay a fee in lieu of. And there's been a lot of conversation about this in the community, and the committee and the planning board were looking as to how to come up with the right balance on this. So the thought was to mandate that the affordable units would have to be in any new construction multifamily development. And this kind of makes sense because in a multifamily development, those affordable units are really going to be indistinguishable from market rate units. You're not going to know if you're renting apartment 106, that apartment 107 next to you is an affordable unit because you all look the same. Whereas what is being proposed in this bylaw is to still allow for the option in an open space residential design subdivision, which has a requirement of 10% affordable, would still have the option to allow for a fee in lieu of. There was a lot of conversation about this, and in some instances, an affordable unit may be able to put into these types of subdivisions, but the reality of the marketplace today is that subdivisions are building much more homogeneous neighborhoods. All the houses are 3,000 square foot homes, or all of this, we don't see mixed neighborhoods being built because that's not what the market is dictating today. So there, in these conversations that we hear over and over again, it is, do you really want to have a 3,000 square foot mini mansion next to a 1,200 square foot ranch, which is an affordable unit? What does that do to the social fabric of that neighborhood? And there's pros and cons in looking at this in either way, but where the committee fell down on this was, let's leave the option available that a fee in lieu of would be allowed. And kind of to go back to the whole issue about why we introduced open space residential to begin with, the public purpose there was first and foremost for open space. It ended up, so it was an open space subdivision that allowed for reduced lot sizes, and the public good that would be served would be to increase or to protect open space. It ended up getting tagged with an affordable housing requirement, which is okay, but that wasn't the first and foremost primary public purpose of why we entered into open space residential design when this came forward 10, 15 years ago. And again, the zoning map changes, breaking up the commercial district into the smaller zones, as I had mentioned, bringing the zoning district boundaries to the lot lines. The Great Swamp zoning right now is heavy industrial. The town owns a significant portion of that, and the recommendation is to change that zoning to a park district. And then the small lot zoning dimensional requirements is placed in the text of the bylaw. There's been a lot of talk about this. It came up a lot last night. The zoning bylaw committee has had a lot of conversations about it. The planning board has had a lot of conversations. The public has had a lot of conversations about it. There are proponents and opponents of doing this. And during the discussion with the planning board, the agreement that came out of the meeting with the zoning bylaw committee was that dimensional requirements for step-down zoning would be included in the text of this bylaw, but it would not show up on the map, and that we don't know where it's going in town. The planning board wants to pursue this. It is a daunting task to undertake, because to do this right, you really need to go into the neighborhoods and talk to the people that you're affecting. So currently today, we have one single-family residential district, which is an R40 district, which means everyone in town has to have 1 acre and 150 feet of frontage to be in compliance. When you look at certain neighborhoods in town that were developed prior to this being passed in 1956, there's a lot of neighborhoods that have less than 1 acre, have less frontage than 150 feet. So what the planning board was really trying to do was to try and figure out how can we equitably treat those people to make those parcels compliant. And that could be accomplished through half-acre zoning or possibly quarter-acre zoning. And that's where we come up with an R20 or an R10 designation. The zoning bylaw committee looked at this. Staff had gone through our GIS process and pulled off some data for certain neighborhoods, and we saw what could potentially be done, but again, we weren't ready to say that this was something that was going to happen as part of this zoning bylaw package that's being brought forward. So the compromise was look at what other communities are doing, and we grabbed Wilmington, I think Wilmington, Burlington, maybe Reading, looking at those communities and what half-acre and quarter-acre zoning looked like, and then what the setbacks were, and what open space requirements and height and everything else was. And the committee and the planning board agreed that we would use what was put into this bylaw today. So there are dimensional requirements for an R10 and an R20 single-family district. Now, we've done this in the past where we have put districts into the text of the bylaw and then never had it show up on the zoning map. We had a district that was called R80 at one time because back in the late 90s, instead of going to smaller lot zoning, there was a movement to try and go to larger lot zoning. There really doesn't seem to be a market today for 2-acre lots. You know, most people, 1 acre is a significant size, and the market is moving towards smaller lots. We're seeing, just from a subdivision perspective, I think the last 1 acre subdivision, 1 acre parcel subdivision that was done may have been done in the early 2000s. All of the subdivisions since then have come in as open space residential, which are coming in at lot sizes that could be downwards of 10,000 square feet. So it's usually somewhere between 10 and 15,000 square foot lots since about 2004, I think, is what we're seeing out there. So again, there's been a lot of talk about this. This zoning bylaw, as it's being proposed today, is not going to change any section of town and impose small lots on any type of neighborhoods. The discussion needs to occur first, and the planning board, staff, zoning bylaw committee all understand that. So moving forward, we have these 2 public sessions last night and tonight. January, we're looking to do an additional 2 evening public sessions and then also a daytime public session. Sometime January, February, the zoning bylaw draft will be submitted as a warrant article for the 2020 annual town meeting. And then April of 2020, the planning board will hold its public hearing. And I would anticipate that that would probably be over the course of 2 evenings, so it would probably be early April, first planning board meeting in April, and then May 2020 is the annual town meeting. So for more information on this, the zoning bylaw committee does have a webpage. It's listed here. We are putting out the e-alerts from the town's website. And if you haven't signed up for that, I suggest that you do, because it's a good way of receiving information as things change or as meetings are occurring, that you can find out information. And then we also set up a separate email address where we'll take questions that anyone may have regarding the draft zoning bylaw. And then my contact information is there. One thing I want to point out real quickly, as soon as I get out of this page, is up on the website for the zoning bylaw committee, there is this comparison, side-by-side comparison of the existing zoning bylaw on the left-hand side. So it starts off with section 1,000 and runs all the way out to 10,000. And then what the comparable sections are in the draft zoning bylaw. So you can actually look at this side by side. Now, some of this is color coded. So here is an example, 1,300 in the current bylaw has a scope section. It's highlighted in green because there is no real comparable section in the proposed bylaw that matches up to this. And then there's other areas that are red, which are deleted in their entirety, which I had mentioned earlier in the presentation on certain areas of the bylaw that were deleted in their entirety. And then blue are sections that there was no change at all. And those sections primarily are the floodplain overlay, the floodplain district, groundwater protection overlay district, and the adult entertainment section of the bylaw. Those weren't changed at all. They were all just brought forward into the new zoning bylaw. So with that, we will take questions, if there are any.
Do you want to mention that the map and the use tables on the website too?
Oh, yes, thank you, Anna. In addition, the draft zoning map and the use table are on the website also. We've kind of set up that web page for the zoning bylaw committee that everything on the left is current with the exception of the archive tab. So if you wanted to find older documents, you can hit the archive tab and see other things that the committee has worked on. But it's the most current product that is on that left-hand column so that you can easily find the draft bylaw, the side-by-side comparison, the use table, and the zoning map. Okay, so no questions. Well, I'd like to thank those that came out this evening. And as I said, this is going to be a continuous process that we have going up till town meeting. So we look forward to receiving emails, questions, and people showing up at the presentations that we'll be having in January. Thank you.